joining us today for this session. And it's going to be a super interesting and lively one, we promise that. And the topic of the session is bridging the gap between climate tech and financial services. The session has been organized in joint collaboration between NMD Plus and Whitesight, and we're very excited to see our research report evolve into this live forum where we get to hear from the experts themselves and add some nuanced perspectives to this theme. I am Afshan, Dadan, your host and moderator for this session. I am the co-founder and COO at Whitesight, a research firm that explores white space opportunities and emerging trends in the fintech space globally. So today we have with us a very dazzling panel full of some fintech heroes, I would say personally heroes of mine as well, whose work is equipping the finance industry to become more sustainable and green. So with that introduction, I'm going to give a short description and intro of each of the panelists we have over here so that all of us can get to know them better, starting with Monika. So Monika is the co-founder and co-CEO of the Nordic payment service provider Enfuce. Her visionary thinking and her 20 plus years of experience in this fast-paced payment industry has enabled Enfuce to integrate services for its customers in record time. Building sustainable solutions is a core value of the company, and this is made possible thanks to Monika's wide knowledge of the industry. She believes wholeheartedly that a business is nothing without a great team of people, and that is why she's joined forces with industry experts as co-founders and employees. Enfuce is one of the leading fintechs in Europe with close to 13 million end users on its platform and has very recently raised a commendable Series C funding of 45 million euros. So congratulations, Monika, and to your team for that. And we welcome you to the panel discussion today.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me.
Of course. Next up, we've got Ulrich with us. He is the co-founder and CEO of Ecolytiq, a company that supplies climate action infrastructure for sustainable finance. Throughout his life, Ulrich has been fascinated by technology and even started programming computers when he was only 10 years old. Later on, he followed his childhood passion for technology and founded multiple companies that enable new disruptive business models through software and digitalization. With years of business experience under his belt, Ulrich founded Ecolytiq in 2020 to initiate change with sustainable banking. Ecolytiq's sustainability as a service solution enables banks, fintech companies, and other financial service providers to show their customers the individual impact their purchasing behavior is having on the environment in real time. So Ulrich, welcome. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you.
Hi there.
Awesome. So next up, we have Emma, who's joining us. She is the CEO of the UK EU operations of CoGo. And CoGo is a purpose-driven organization offering sustainability solutions. Emma has spent many years of her career working with data scientists and using behavioral science to analyze people's shopping habits to work out how to encourage people to shop more. But now she's on a mission to use data for good. The power of consumer data and behavioral science can be used to empower customers to shop more sustainably and ethically. And that is what CoGo does by marrying up ethically minded consumers and their impact priorities with payment data to assess how their spending reflects values and nudges them towards businesses that are a good match. CoGo is building a movement of people and businesses who can start making a difference in our world every day. Emma, it's very nice to have you join us, and I hope this panel discussion will be a great one with your addition.
Thank you.
And lastly, we have Dave with us, our very dear friend. He is the founder of NMD Plus, a creative data and technology consultancy enabling the best active CX for financial services. Dave is a digital professional who has spent the last 25 years agency side, understanding what customers want and need and ensuring that they're truly represented. His primary focus has been financial services, and he has worked with the great and good of the financial services industry globally. His latest venture, NMD Plus, uses personalization to enrich and enhance customer relationships in the finance sector, They think beyond traditional UX, harnessing the power of digital channels and data to deliver incredible customer relationships that are personalized, relevant, valuable, meaningful, and provide a return on investment. So Dave, a very warm welcome. Thanks for organizing all of this, and thank you for being a part of the panel as well.
My pleasure. No, well, thank you for that great introduction.
Of course. I hope I'm not the only one starstruck over here. A warm welcome to all of you attending, and thank you for being a part of this discussion. So without further ado, I'd just like to give a small kind of context piece before we get started with the discussion. The reason why we decided to explore this subject in the very first place, this was during COP26 when it was ongoing, and both our teams at Whitesight and NMD Plus were deliberating a way to showcase the fintech side of things. Now, as consumers and even as people from the industry, we're always reading about and hearing about the green initiatives by banks, non-banks, and even fintechs, but rarely do we hear much about how things function under the hood. With that thread in hand, we began unraveling the details of who are the players operating behind the scenes of these green finance initiatives. And it was a fascinating study to learn about these companies and the solutions they were building. So that's the context for the topic and how we started. And without further ado now, I'd like to kickstart the discussion. So here we go. The very first question to begin with, and this is an open-ended one for all of you to answer, is how do you perceive the role of financial services in effectively tackling the climate change? So Emma, if you could go first, and then we can go in order.
Yeah, look, I think it's very well known that it's a critical decade of change, and we need to deliver solutions that scale and impact. And I think what we've seen as a business at CoGo is partnering with financial services like we do with NatWest or Commonwealth Bank. We can get that scale. So, you know, with NatWest, for example, they've got 8 million customers, but it's not just about getting into engaged customers, it's also about impact. So we did some analysis for a bank recently, and we showed that the combined collective footprint of their customer base was the same as the emissions of Fiji, and suddenly you're kind of seeing the kind of influence they can have. Wow. But then actually when we looked at modeling out a few actions that they could take, you know, we said that they could reduce their carbon emissions by about 600 million tons. It's kind of the equivalent of planting 1 million trees. And you can suddenly see the power of these banks coming to life and the ability to enable and influence and help their customers make kind of better sustainable decisions around their spending.
Monika, if you may.
Yeah, and that's amazing. And I think the key is, as Emma said, to get people to understand what they can do and how it can affect. But just looking like, why are banks and financial institutions in the heart of actually impacting is, of course, they handle money. Money equals consumption or enables consumption. Consumption equals emissions. So when you really go into the core of everything, buying, paying, consuming, investing, whatever that relates to monetary values also become a consequence for emissions. So banks need to wake up, and everyone enabling goods and services sold, that they have a responsibility and above all an ability to impact. And I think that's why the Emma's, for example, examples were really good. And I think that's the biggest hurdle, to educate people that having an impact isn't that hard. And we need to help people understand by doing small changes, we can have big impact.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes, Dave, please go ahead.
Oh, well, it's interesting because my background, as you explained, is more UX and design, and I've helped big banks over the years to develop their online banking and their mobile apps. And I guess fairly recently, I started pondering sort of climate change and the role financial services could play. And I was like, oh, you know, one of the things we're trying to do at NMD Plus is enrich that kind of mobile banking experience. And I was like, well, actually, this climate stuff, that's probably something that's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say, but I didn't know that any of these businesses existed. And someone I was talking to said, oh, you should go and have a look at CoGo. And I was like, I went and had a look at CoGo and I was like, wow, this is it. You know, this is really fascinating that there's an organization which is taking that transactional data and enriching it with kind of something which is really useful beyond the kind of financial stuff. And I guess for me, it was like, well, there's so many people who use online banking around the world. You know, if you want to reach that audience with a message, then this is a very good place to do it. And, you know, that's, you know, sort of coincided with some of the things that you were thinking about, I think, Afshan. So it's been really interesting to then see that actually there's this niche part of the kind of fintech world where this is kind of happening, but it really has an incredibly important role to play, I think. And it's interesting how each of you are kind of tackling things. But I mean, there's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of differences. And Ulrich, I think when I talked to you talked about the kind of, once you've got the information, is what you do with it, which I think is a really fascinating area as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I completely agree that banks play a very significant role here, and they have the power to change things. And if you look at the scale we could reach through the banks, this is really important. So look at look at HSBC. They're having 50 million consumers, and today, I mean, they're more focused on they want to get climate neutral, net neutral. They're focusing on their 200,000 employees and how to get them, you know, their offices in a better energy position there. So instead of, you know, or on top of, you know, focusing on the 200,000 employees, there's a much bigger factor to scale when they look into their 50 million consumers and educate their 50 million consumers about their footprint. And exactly like you said, like nobody's really aware about the footprint. What is my number, even if that's, you know, not 100% precise. It's still the payment data, and that's the most important point, reflects my daily consumption behavior very well. There's no better data on the planet to calculate individual footprint. And this is basically the idea of telling customers, you know, payment is digital. Everything we do every day is reflected in payments. So why don't we start with payments and calculating the footprint there, and also educate people, you know, not to become only aware of it, but also to engage deeper. And, you know, tell them, you know, next time you book a flight, maybe go for a day flight, because night flight emit like 2 times as much CO2 as day flights. Did you already know that? So these, you know, small little things. I mean, if I fly day flight or night flight, for me, it doesn't matter, right? But if the emissions are double the size, well, I didn't know that. So these little tips and tricks, and if you scale that to the 50 million HSBC consumers, that's where you scale.
That's such a crucial point you highlighted, Ulrich, and even I wasn't aware of that. So that's something to keep in mind, definitely. So I remember Dave posing this thought to me when we began this research about how at the end of the day, it's the customer who needs to be benefited from these services, not the banks, not the solution providers. It has to be the customers. So therefore, what is it that you keep in mind as someone designing solutions for consumers who may or may not be aware of their carbon impact? And Emma, I would love to hear your take on this, because I read that you had quite a lot of experience in behavioral science and understanding how consumers perceive things. So I leave the question to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think there's probably 3 areas. One is, and probably this is kind of one that overrides everything, it cannot feel punitive. You know, it's a bit like when you're losing weight, you kind of have to go in with a mindset, I'm going to step on the scales. It might be a little bit scary, but I've got to at least take the step. So what we do is we work very hard about whether, especially when we're working with the banks, like where does it integrate in that online banking experience or in the mobile bank? So it seems it's seen as a kind of added part of the proposition as opposed to something that is being forced on me. So I would say that's kind of one thing in terms of the UX that we really focus on. The second point, which Ulrich and Monika both mentioned, is this kind of education point. You know, carbon emissions, we talk a lot in our business. We will all talk a lot around carbon emissions, equivalents and chat. And the climate scientists, we work with Mike Berners-Lee, you know, that's just his language, that's his currency. But my mum and dad, my friends, they haven't got a clue what that is. So we're constantly thinking about giving it context. You know, what are the equivalents? Is it trees planted, people get it, you know, miles driven in car. You know, when we kind of say the average UK footprint, for example, is about a ton, but just over a ton, and we kind of say that's the equivalent of driving up and down the country 5 times in a petrol car. People can get their head around that. There's other things like smartphone charging, donut eating. We tried lots of different ways. It's just got to make sense until it becomes a kind of current currency. And the other aspect is around giving people benchmarks. You know, how do I stack up so they don't feel kind of, you know, bad or good, or just some kind of indication. And kind of finally, the kind of key area that we really focus is what Ulrich talked about, is kind of action orientated. So once you get people around like what it means, it's like, but what can I do about it? What are the actions? And it's also getting the context again in terms of what's material versus not, and then being able to see that impact back, because having worked in behavioural change for a long time, and in grocery, I'm trying to get people to buy more. I'm actually kind of know that the importance of feedback. So once someone does something, makes a behavior, makes a change to their kind of normal buying habits, how do we reward that and recognize it and really celebrate and create that feedback loop so that they can really see that they're making a difference? I think those are the kind of 3 things that we really focus on when we're designing our UX.
Very fascinating to hear that. Thank you, Emma. Dave, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well from a consumer perspective, and what you've learned from your experience.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, because I think you know, there's a few things, like you need to be aware that this is something that you should be worrying about. And I guess just relying on the news media isn't kind of enough, because a lot of people kind of miss what's going on. And I guess it's interesting as you know, people like, or companies like CoGo are kind of building relationships with banks. The banks themselves are starting to promote these and, you know, raising awareness about it. But I think, you know, for me, it was kind of really interesting to actually think that this is something which is available and I can kind of look at. And I think, you know, there was a few things for me that I went through, and you know, again, I'm sort of slightly embarrassed because I feel like I should have been involved in this a lot sooner than I am, and I'm sort of feel like I'm a bit late to the party. But the reality is sort of, as I started going through things like my carbon footprint and looking at the detail that you can get through some of these apps, I started going, this is going to require a massive change on my behalf. And I guess what's been useful is to have some of the pointers in terms of, you know, examples like, you know, easy things you can do all the way to more difficult things that you can do. Now, you know, I'll give you an example of something which, you know, I used to do a lot of traveling. We used to have a lot of foreign holidays. And now what I've realized by doing some of these calculations that, you know, I don't know what it is. The average person in the UK, their carbon footprint is about 10 tons a year, which is massively high. But that's the reality. You take a flight, you basically, that's, you know, go to New York and back, that's like 2 or 3 tons of carbon on top of, you know, so just flying a lot is just not, it's kind of not a behavior which is terribly acceptable in this world. And I think, you know, I actually went through a degree of like, oh my God, you know, there was a past life which I loved. I love traveling, and I'm going to have to reshape that. And I think it's been quite interesting how having data and some of the sort of content has been really useful in me kind of arriving at those conclusions. I think the next step for me would be a lot more kind of concrete stuff in terms of ideas around alternatives, you know, so a lot more train travel, or, you know, all the other bits and pieces. And I think what's great about the solutions that we've kind of looked at is that there's a lot which kind of comes out of the back in terms of content around help and ideas around some of these things. And I think that's kind of critical. And, you know, frankly, the banks are rubbish at kind of giving people ideas. So actually having third parties who understand this subject matter to provide that kind of content is brilliant, to be honest with you.
Absolutely. And I think it's never too late to start. I think we all can agree on that. It's just that you need that first step, and then you're all good to go. And we've already got one question in the Q&A box, so I am going to take that up towards the end of the session once we're through with our main discussion points. The next question I would like to kind of direct it towards Monika and Ulrich. Financial services are one starting point, of course, but there's obviously the need to evolve sustainable practices across all consumptive industries. I think there's a platform, this is where a platform or embedded services play becomes vital. And both of your companies have partnered with networks, so to say, Enfuce with the Amazon Web Services and Ecolytiq with Visa. How does this play into your strategy of extending beyond the domain of financial services? Would love to hear about that.
Well, if we think about us, of course, as we are a payment service provider, we enable the issuance of money. So we are directly connected to Visa and MasterCard because that's one part where the payments come through. But what we did is that when we took our service, My Carbon Action, it's about the impact. Then we wanted it to be used by whoever wants to. So our solution is country specific from the background of the data. And then, of course, it's about how do we enable change for the consumer behavior. So the scope level 3 data. And that's why we did it into AWS, just because it's about impact and we don't need to sit. Our core business is about enabling payments. And then we want to enable payments that are more sustainable. And that's how My Carbon Action was born. And the reason why we put it in AWS is that we were the first one in the world to put card payment issuing in a public cloud. So it felt really natural that our, how should I say, SaaS type of service could be put to anyone to be consumed from there. And then, of course, when it comes to card payments and payments, then it's very regulated. So then you need to come and buy it from me. But that's the reason why we put it there.
And for us, I mean, partners are really important. So because we as a small startup, we can only get to the scale we want with such large partners as for example, for us, Visa. So we really need to make it easy for the banks to use our product. And one of the key drivers is that you basically have a technical product which is easy to integrate and which is easy to buy, right? So today we are part of a new Visa product called Eco Benefits. So you can just buy the service when you buy this new card product, right? It's a buy product, and it's a comprehensive solution. And then we are part of that comprehensive solution. So the banks can just buy it, integrate it, use it, and go ahead. So that's I think one of the most important points, to not really make it complicated to scale, but make it easy for the banks to move. And also, you know, going beyond banks in regards to the merchants, for example, as we see that data is getting more transparent, supply chains getting more transparent, and the Unilevers of this world saying, well, there's a CO2 footprint on each of our products in the future. So we need that from the other merchants too, to get, you know, more precise calculation on your footprint when you go shopping at Tesco. So what does it mean? And we are working on getting, you know, all the data in there. It's not there yet, but we are working on it. And, you know, partners help us to scale also there and get the merchants to move and give the data to us. So that's a very important factor for us.
I mean, can I just, because for me, it's quite interesting because, you know, it is something I wondered, and I've chatted to a few people who say, well, actually transactional data in banking, like if for instance, you get one thing which says this is your Tesco shop, whereas actually if you're able to look into your Tesco shopping basket, that would be kind of helpful in terms of understanding a bit more about the granularity of what's there. And so it sounds like with Visa, you're a bit more able, or at least looking to kind of go down to the shopping basket level. Is that right?
Absolutely. So we are working on it. I mean, it has different, there are different areas. For one of the pilots we're currently looking into is travel, because travel, as you mentioned, flights and are really intense in the energy and the CO2. So what we're trying to get is really, for example, from airlines, not only that you book the flight for £400, and if we don't have the destination, this could be London, Berlin, or it could be London, Thailand. right? So we don't know. So we need the airlines to come up with, and we're working on a pilot where we get the exact destination, the amount of stopovers, even the airplane type, right? So we get everything to really do a very precise calculation. And once we have that, it's the calculation is really where it should be. Right now, we can only work with averages, but it's every category we're working with, not only travel but also grocery and lifestyle, shopping, everything needs to be on that detail level, as I was just mentioning with travels. But we are working on it, so this is getting better basically every day, and it will be, I think, 3 years from now. We believe this will be a commodity. This will be, like the Unilevers of this world. There will be merchants telling you, and airlines and rental car companies telling you exactly what your footprint was with your last transaction. And they need to. I mean, that's they have to do it. And once starts doing it, then the others in the market move, right? You see it with Unilever now. Nestle is doing the same thing, right? So it needs to, just needs to a kickoff.
I mean, I think one of the things I do wonder is how, because I mean, I guess policy will start driving a lot of these things. So having everything in place to kind of inform people is in all sort of aspects of the kind of transactions and payments, and is kind of critical. But I guess you're coming at it from a different direction, which is your kind of enterprises, all enterprises looking to solve the problem. So I guess one of the things that I wondered is about the kind of data, what sits underneath this. So are you all using standard sets of kind of carbon data, or are you sort of looking for best of breed, and how's that all working? Because I guess standardization is going to be critical as part of this in the future as well.
Yeah, if I look at Enfuce side, the data is, of course, we collaborate with university scientists that have been doing 18 years of carbon footprint calculation, and then the data is country specific, because it's a huge difference to live in Finland or UK or Germany or France. Just because, like, if you look at in France, most of the power is still coming from really the nuclear power plants. And then in Germany, more fossil fuels, etc. So that has a bearing. But I think one thing that we need to understand is also that preciseness, like I'm Finnish, so we want to be even more precise than the Germans, but it doesn't matter. People don't care, because as Emma said, if you don't even understand what's your number, it's about how do we. So when we did with Rabobank proof of concept in the Netherlands, it was really about customers understanding, like, what is my emissions based on my lifestyle. And then customers can also add a lot of data. So for example, for us, it's about how many hours do you fly, for just to, like, get some, and then you can correct on a transaction level, because in the end of the day, enabling change, and then you have the transaction data as a baseline, so that you don't get the people who try to screw themselves, because in the end of the day, it becomes a problem when the banks start incentivizing. So if you say that you get loyalty points that can be then turned into cash or something like that, then of course you're building in fraud capabilities. And I'm an old banker and finance, so I live and breathe, like, how do you disable fraud? So I think it's really important to understand. And you said that you like the train left the station, but it's early days. Everyone can jump on board, and will have to, and standardization will come, and it will be led, of course, by major players, and there will be scandals, like there are always, greenwashing and stuff. But I think in the end of the day, we can't afford to wait for something perfect and for policies to drive it, because then we are in 2030 and we're all fucked.
Monika,
finish. Nonine, as I'd like to say.
Monika, I so support what you're saying. I think we sit in a lot of meetings where people talk about SKU level data, and obviously coming from a grocery behaviour change, I work with a lot of climate scientists, and how do we get that? The really important point is the payment data is good enough to give people an understanding of their carbon footprint. And as Ulrich said, it will improve over time through technology, digital receipts, working with retailers, working with industries. That's kind of a given. I think what's critical that gets missed out of some of the models where I'm pretty sure we're aligned is that the scope 3 is really an important part. So, we use input output models, we work at country level, market specific, we work with leading academics, kind of similar approach. That over time will become standardized, but we actually, as long as we're kind of, there or thereabouts, there are material actions that people can just take, in terms of just helping to reduce carbon emissions that will start making material difference if as a collective we all start taking action. And that is your flying, your food, your fashion, there are just some fundamentals, your fuel, your energy, it's these big things. And actually, given where we see that consumers are in terms of their maturity of understanding, it's actually just finding out the basics and getting this idea of kind of, I talk about like 10,000 steps or 5 a day, there's just some simple concepts that we just need to have ingrained in us, which is, it's not punitive. It's not that these actions are bad, but just consciously do things. If you're going to fly on holiday, be aware of that and just be conscious about the impact you're having. And that's what we really encourage. So, Monika, I'm totally agree, because we have to encourage us all to take action, because by all taking just a bit of action, we will make a significant impact. And that's what this is all about.
Yeah, and I 100% agree, especially the punitive side. And here, since there are maybe some Swedes in the audience, we don't do the punitive path. So even though we are the compliance-driven nation of the world, the Finns, it is about positive reinforcement, because exactly the one that if you need to lose weight, you don't want to go hearing all the time, you need to lose weight. So it's about how can you do it and what are the small steps and the small wins. And what we did also is we wanted to make it simple. So it's actually that what I eat, how I live, how I go from A to B, and what I buy, and then the services. So if just being understanding of where I emit, having these small changes, just as look at lifestyle, an average Finn eats 70 kilos of red meat a year. You really have to eat that much red meat. And just like, again, there's a lot of small things that you can do. And then again, if you go to a supermarket and you buy some food, the emissions caused by you actually going there and getting the banana or avocado, that's probably more massive than that single avocados. But then of course, what you buy, what you consume, it's what is offered. But I think here is the power of the many. So as you said, small actions, and what we keep talking about a lot is about like avoid, reduce, and then the third part is compensate. But it's all about trying to avoid emitting. Then it's about how do we reduce, because I have one colleague, he had a good example that the world is in the same bathtub. So it's not the Germans or the Chinese or we have a joint problem. We need to then the bathtub is already full with water, so emission is tipping over the edges. We need to somehow reduce and stop adding new ones. So I think these are really the point. And as you said, like the 10,000 steps a day, if you want to diet, eat less sugar and go out walking. So again, what are the things that you in your daily life easily can do? And I think that's where the data already now in the payments are enough to give you in a positive reinforcement. And the better we can get that information before we pay, instead of after we've paid, the better we can do the decisions. But I think those are the things that technology will help evolve. And I'm really happy that all of us here are doing something about it. So I think that's really steps in the right direction.
Compensation, I think, is a good keyword. So that's also something where consumers, it has to be rewarding. It doesn't have to be like, oh, you that amount of CO2 now. You feel bad, but you can also do something about it. You can offset this, but this has to be easy, and with one click, book the flight, do the offsetting. I had a lot of discussion about offsetting. Is it good? Is it bad? Especially with a North American market. So it depends on the continent and on the mentality. But it's one way of compensating for what you have been doing. And if you go even beyond offsetting, you go into investment. You can also offset your footprint by doing investment into good ESG sustainable products, right? And if you enable consumers to basically funnel their money into the right courses, this might even have a huge leverage on the you can change your behavior But if you do on top some investment into the right and funnel the money into the right things, and companies that, you know, whatever, suck out CO2 from the atmosphere, whatever, but these companies need the money and need the people to invest. And the funny thing is that these investments even normally perform much better than the traditional investments. So the BlackRocks already got the message there. And I think consumers are also willing to go and invest money into these things because they want to do something. Everybody wants to do something. It's just so easy. Just put your monthly saving plan into sustainable investment, and that's it, right? So that's where you can start tomorrow. Huh?
Yeah, and I think, like, just as a small comment here, I think the good thing is that you can actually, so a climate friendly diet is a healthy diet. And then you can say, so you actually can live longer, healthier and happier and become rich if you take this climate impact seriously. So I think that's a lot of positives. And these are the things that we need to highlight, because it's not about, you know, going in, living in a cage. I mean, like, the most sustainable thing for the earth is that we would all die. And that's what will happen eventually. Planet will not be destroyed. Humankind will not survive unless we start doing it. And we can actually do it by becoming healthier, happier, and rich. How hard can that be?
I love it, Monika. I wanted to follow up on the offsetting. Offsetting, there was a question about this, and Ulrich, you brought it, is if you talk to the kind of climate scientists we talk to, you know, Mike Berners-Lee, guys in our business, they are very clear in terms of there is no role for offsetting. We will not offset our way out of the climate crisis. But the reality is that, to Monika, your point about living in a dark cave, it's very difficult. There are some unavoidable emissions. And actually there is a role, and we talk about compensating as a, you know, if you've understood and you've reduced as much as you can, there are these unavoidable roles, and there is a role for offsetting, on the basis that the people that you're offsetting with are accredited and are incremental and gold standard. That is really important, because there is a lot of controversy. You know, there's a lot of lack of consumer confidence. I'd say we see only about 3% of people actually coming in and offsetting. And I think until we're really clear on where that balance is between offsetting and taking action is, and kind of holistically as a society, I think it's really important. And we also hear banks grappling with this. You know, we have to hit these targets. We know we're not going to get there. Should we just offset our way out? Feels a bit of a cheat's way. And it's like, yeah, you know, it's really important that we're able to find that right balance between really focused on the offsetting on the unavoidable, as opposed to as a way of compensating for our behaviors.
So, I mean, it's, again, it's for me, it's so interesting to hear you say that, because I guess that's the conclusion I reached just as a consumer, starting to go into what does offsetting mean, and realizing that, you know, an offset on British Airways is different from an offset on Sri Lankan Airways, for instance. And, you know, I think actually raising the awareness of all of these issues is kind of the critical first step, which is what you're all saying. And I think, you know, again, that I love the points about the data doesn't need to be precise. And in actual fact, you know, I guess the more precise it is, the more people might worry about where are you getting my data from? So, you know, a bit more fuzziness to begin with isn't perhaps a bad thing. I mean, I don't know what you kind of feel about that.
I think from my perspective, David, I've worked for most of my career on customer data, and there needs to be a clear value exchange. I think, you know, we have to have the right basis for the data we're using in terms of the emissions factor, market specific input output models, those kind of things. But the reality is the average consumer don't necessarily care about the detail. What they care about is what's the value exchange and how is my data being used. And I think that's the key point around fuzziness or not. It's kind of like, okay, this is being used, it's something I opt into, it's something that actually is going to help me, and there's a clear value exchange. I think that's the really important thing with any customer data being used.
Yeah, I 100% agree with Emma. And then it's about the credibility of the player, in that sense that we know what we're doing, we have the trusted, you know, background check, so you can rest assured that this is best that there is, and things will evolve, so that you take the concern from away from the table. And then as Emma said, you really focus on the value exchange, because why would I want to give my data? I want to get something in return. Just as an example, if I like an old banker again, in Finland we tend to own two properties. It's the house we live in, and then it's a cottage. And then of course, geothermal heating versus direct heat or this, there's massive changes. So again, if you buy a house, which is a huge investment, and then you see it as a lifelong investment, and then if I could get from my bank that, yes, we can see, because they will take the house as a collateral for the loan, because I don't have money to just buy it. If I then could actually get, okay, Monika, we see that your house is built in 2000, it's direct heating, but you could actually get this geothermal heat installed for 25,000 euros, and we would actually just take 0.5% interest rate, which would mean that your house would increase the property value, the collateral risk for the banks would lower, and they would have a clear sustainable impact. And these are the things that I hope that bankers will start thinking more, that there used to be this boom about personal finance management. Take that data to the next level. I mean, like, offer them personal lifestyle money where you can have the savings and you can have the investment and you can have, you know, the changes, etc. So there's a lot to play with. And I think here again, when it's come to data, privacy, etc., the players like us who just take the transactional data, of course, I'm allowed to store and process payment data because that's what I do for a core living. But just looking, I don't need to have personal data. I just need to have transactional data. So I don't need to know your name or address or anything like that. And then I can help the bank, because the bank will have done a KYC, KYB, SCN, all the abbreviations that you can ever think about when it comes to compliance. And that's a core asset also that the bank has, that they have the assets of knowing the customer on that side. So I really think that it's time for people to step up their game, and it's a mindset change that needs to happen, because otherwise you're like, yeah, we would love to do it, but, and there's so many buts and ifs. But then again, as I said, dying is the solution, if nothing else. So that's the positive finish side.
But I believe also, or we believe also that, you know, transparency and openness is something that is really important. You know, what happens with the data, how's the calculation done, and especially when data is not 100% precise, complete, maybe inconsistent. So everything we do at Ecolytiq is based on an open standard. So it's like a wiki approach where everybody can participate, and we encourage everybody to participate. And if there are better numbers, better researches or new studies coming out, then we would like to add them into our calculations. And, you know, we don't want to put the bank on the spot in challenging how this calculation was done. So we are 100% transparent in how we come to the numbers, even if the numbers are not 100% correct, which they cannot be today. And I think this is something consumers really like to see, that, you know, their data is being used in a sensitive way. There's no personal data involved. This is something we again have to stress with every bank. And, you know, it's like, you know, every time again you have to really stress that it's not really about personal data. It's also about how you calculate things and be really transparent in how you come to your numbers. And encourage everybody to participate and you know, get a better databases together
Excellent.
I love how that question just snowballed into all of these different questions. I mean, we've covered a few audience questions there as well. So kind of to go back to one of the questions that I specifically was very interested to hear your views on, was that while we have greenhouse, you know, gas emissions that are a major contributor to the climate catastrophe, there are also aspects of other pollutants like plastics that play a significant role in degrading our environment. We also are facing a freshwater resource crisis across many regions globally. So from your perspective as a technology or solutions provider, how do you see awareness about these aspects being integrated into your solutions, similar to carbon emission assessments that you're you know, presently offering? So Emma, Ulrich, Monika, I would love to hear your views on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. CoGo actually started as a charity 10 years ago with the whole idea of kind of matching consumers and their values with businesses who share them. So we actually have got something called a good impact framework where we look at climate as one pillar, but then there's land and water, waste and community. And over the last 10 years, we've aggregated all the different certifications, accreditations out there into this kind of one massive asset so that we can really help people make decisions about the businesses they spend with and where they share their values, like reducing waste, cruelty free. We actually, when open banking came out in the UK, we actually tested it with living wage data, which is really interesting, showing consumers the impact of how much of their spend is going on living wage and how they can change behavior. The critical part for us, I suppose, when we're thinking about what we do next, and is looking at consumer demand. What are actually consumers driving? And we see a lot in terms of reducing waste, as you said, Afshan, the plastics footprint and living wage. But then we see nuances, like in Australia, it's very much about minority-owned businesses and how can we encourage consumers. The key thing for us is the data there, and yes or no, and is it good enough quality? And then can it be applied both in terms of tracking, but also encouraging behavioural change? Because what we see is that there's one bit, water is very complicated in terms of there's lots of different aspects to water. So the one is, can you get the right data? But then can you encourage the behaviour changes that we need to make? So it's not just as simple as kind of saying, hey, listen, let's track some kind of plastics or waste. It's actually thinking about how we get the data, how we then track it, and how we could turn this into tools and actionable solutions that people can act on.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I'm kind of started thinking maybe me and Emma should just join forces.
Me too, Monika.
Later on, but yeah, definitely, it's the same for us. So from our perspective, of course, being in the Nordics as a company, but then servicing now in Europe and in the Middle East, there are in different countries, different part of the world, different things that matter. So what we have done now is to focus on my carbon action, so on the CO2 emissions side, because that's where we have the most data available real time, if you want to, with the science backed up. And then of course, I mean, like Enfuce is co-founded and co-CEO by 2 women. So for us, it's important of the diversity and inclusion part, and it's different in different parts of the world. So again, I want to leave the world a better place than my parents. I have 4 kids of my own, and I kind of want to look them in the face in 10, 15 years time, and having contributed more to positives than negatives. So I'm really at Enfuce focusing currently on the things I can change and impact. And then of course, then collaboration. So definitely looking into finding partnerships with people who knows their shit, to say it in a nice way, and then, getting shit done. So you don't have to do everything yourself. Find the right ones and then, put it together, and then awesome things can happen.
I think it's also, it still needs to be easy to understand for consumers what's happening. So you have all these different metrics out there: water, land use, biodiversity, CO2. So a lot of different stuff happening. So how can we basically aggregate this and put it in a metrics that consumers understand? So we're working, for example, on a temperature score, which shows how your behavior is on track with a Paris 1.5 degree target, to make really different metrics aggregate into one figure everybody can understand. It's easy to see, easy to calculate, easy to track, easy. That's I think something where we help consumers to better understand what the behavior really means. And make it understandable, make it easy, make it accessible, and I think that's one of the most important points, because it's easy to change. And people are also willing to change, so you have to enable them to do it with a couple of clicks, as David is already mentioning. So UX, UI is important. And also the progress tracking. So if like for myself, I never go back to the days when I was buying clothes every week or something like that, because I know that what the clothing industry produces right now. So you're completely into a conscious consumption, which doesn't mean you lower your consumption. It's actually for a conscious consumption, sometimes you have to spend more. I mean, a Tesla costs more than the Volkswagen, right? So And you know, this is something where it starts in the mind of the consumers, and you see that people are really willing to spend more. They're even willing to change their banks if the bank doesn't provide such green products, carbon neutral credit card or whatever. Then they you know, 1/3 would switch the banks. So people are really, and you see it at COP26 too, people going onto the streets for climate action. It's not the Gretas out there anymore. It's, you know, it's a broad, like myself, like if you have kids, you're in here for the kids, right? So that's what's happening.
Very fascinating to hear that, and I think I agree with what you mentioned, both Monika and even Emma, that, you know, as more of these data sets become available, it will be kind of a natural evolution to tracking these emissions and these factors as well. So thank you for that. I think we have about 6 minutes left, to be precise, on dot for the session. So we'll move on to the audience Q&A so that we can cover those questions as well. The very first that we've got is from Max, and he says that he'll be interested in understanding more about how you estimate the carbon footprint of different types of consumption to educate customers and change their behavior. These estimates need to be credible to build trust, and he has read that these estimates are more accurate in terms of some sectors and others, for example, mobility, groceries, or fashion, using the MCC codes and not individual product codes. Some include direct but not indirect emissions, etc. So once you get into it, it gets very complex. And how are you exactly tackling this challenge?
You've got 1 minute to answer it. So.
I think, Afshan, the level of detail that you need to explain this depends on who you're talking to. So with some people, like the average consumer won't even understand what an indirect, direct, scope 3, and actually they don't need to. What they need to do is get confidence in actually the way it's calculated. Most people don't understand that every pound they spend has an impact to every euro. So there's actually just a basic level. But if you're going in to talk to banks, then you need to make sure that you have an incredible, as we all three of us know, you know, you've got absolute credibility and integrity of your data. But there's absolutely right that there are some industries and some sectors, some categories that are easier. There are also a lot of merchants out there who have calculated in carbon footprint and can be verified. So when we are modeling the different actions you can take, we're looking at, can we see a reductive impact in your carbon emissions, and using that, and can we do that by merchant? And over time, this will only improve in terms of the data access, the data quality, and those merchants' ability to publish their own footprints.
Yeah, exactly the same. And for example, mobility as a service, that's pretty easy. So if I look at from our perspective, we enable the issuance of money. So for example, for a mobility service provider who has an app and provides you transportation, and then they have the card or the payment method, being it Apple Pay, Google Pay, or whatever, that we actually then do, we have the authorization. What we can then do is that when you choose, you know, let's say that you have in the Uber app, you wanna have a car, and then you would choose to take Uber sustainable. I know the Uber X and this, but like, let's say, and then it's always an electric car. And then you will choose where you're going and where you're starting and where you're going. You can actually get, then what we would do, we would calculate based on the kilometers or meters, and then the vehicle and in the country, which means like it would be London. We would know that the average, you know, emissions for production of electricity is blah, 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 which means that this kind of car has something, and then the meters and kilometers spent is something that we will then show that, okay, this is the emissions of this particular transport. Of course, there's a lot of things that needs to be in mind, but this is just like, do I take a normal like diesel or whatever car? But then in the other segments, when we don't get that detailed level data, then it's more about what kind of merchants, and what we also have is that people don't have to, but can also put their lifestyle. So if I go into Tesco and I buy for £100 something, it will say that Tesco is something. So it's a supermarket, for example, 80% of the goods are food related and 20% are like, you know, toilet paper, etc. The assumption. And then if I'm a meat lover or I'm a vegan, of course, my portfolio will be a little bit different. So in the end, this is the highest level. So if I want individuality based on my lifestyle, we have enabled that, but you don't have to. But it's just because as Emma said, when we don't get the basket level data, it still needs to be good enough, which it is.
What we do, we basically ask consumers to help, right? If the data is not there and we don't know how long that flight was, we basically pull up a little survey, which can be done in 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Or we ask, when we see it's a grocery transaction, we ask about what's your consumption habit when it comes to grocery. Are you buying a lot of frozen foods? Are you on a vegan diet? So all these kind of stuff we're asking, and even if not 100% of the consumers complete these surveys, we can still work with peer groups, so we know that this consumer is in that peer group, and 5% of the peer group completed the survey. So we basically transfer the completed surveys to the remaining 95% of the peer group, and then update the calculations so consumers can help with just a few clicks. And I think that's important. So we don't have to wait until all the supply chains are 100% transparent and accessible. So we can work with workarounds in the meantime.
Understood. I think it has a lot to do with certain assumptions and the relating accuracy because of that. Very well. Just one last question from the audience is from Sham. If money equals consumption and that equals emission, how can we get people to consume less with this financial system?
I'm happy to pick this up and give you a real example. So when I started the business with Ben, who's been doing this for 10 years, 2 years ago, 3 days later we went into lockdown and Ben had to go home back to New Zealand, so he had to fly. And as a result, we could see his carbon footprint, which kind of was like ticked along here. And then suddenly there was this like almost, and it looked a bit like this, which was ironic for me, having kind of just stepped into the role. The point is that by people seeing their carbon emissions alongside their spend, and then seeing some benchmarks and understand the tracking, that your natural inclination is to kind of go, oh, wow, okay, I can control this by reducing. So actually, because you're tracking, and then, Ulrich talks about something we talk about a lot, conscious consumption. It's just being very conscious. And you can see in the lockdown, it was a very positive time in terms of your carbon emissions, because you suddenly see your spend drop off, and then you see it graduating up. So by seeing the impact of every pound you spend, it's actually very motivational. And probably the overriding thing that we will all agree with is one of the biggest changes everyone can make is just simply spend less. We should really be consuming back in the level about the 1950s. We should be repairing and maintaining, and not just this disposable consumerism that we're also used to. So buying less is actually very critical, and buying smarter, buying smarter, more sustainably. So you can see it by tracking the emissions versus your spend. You do get an impression of kind of how much better it is to reduce your emissions.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I think it's been a fascinating. I mean, could literally go on forever and ever, I think, about this. So, it's just super impressive to kind of meet you all and know, this is the kind of cutting edge of climate tech and how it relates to financial services. So thank you so much for coming and joining us. I've learned a tremendous amount today, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
And now you know that the train hasn't left. You just need to jump on board.
I know, and I'm a very willing kind of, but it's fascinating, and I'm really grateful for your perspective. So, again, like everything, I think the more you start putting your head into understanding what's going on, the more you understand. So, just talking to the three of you, and our research and what we find out, Afshan, it's very kind of enlightening. So thank you.
Thank you, David and Afshan, for hosting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for attending, everybody.
Bye-bye to the audience.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.